All right, guys. So today we are going to be talking about two specific skills. Are you guys going to practice specifically two skills while you guys are reading? All right. And so those two skills, number one, we're going to determine the theme of a text, and I'm not going to do that, but I'll talk about the things that you should be paying attention to while you guys are determining the theme. And we're also going to be talking about how language or how words or how the phrases that are used can help us understand the mood and the tone of a text, right? The connotation. Okay. So the story that we're going to be reading today is Harrison Bergeron. It's by Kurt Vonnegut. Now, Kurt Vonnegut is a very prolific writer. He does a lot of science fiction writing, and if you're interested in these kind of stories, definitely look him up. A lot of his stuff tends to be pretty dark. A lot of it's very dystopian. So look it up if you like this kind of story. So the year was 2081, and everybody was finally equal. They weren't only equal before God and the law, they were equal every which way. Nobody was smarter than anybody else. Nobody was better looking than anybody else. Nobody was stronger or quicker than anybody else. All this equality was due to the 211th, 212th, and 213th Amendments to the Constitution, and to the unceasing vigilance of agents of the United States Handicapper General. All right, so right away we are starting with some background knowledge. A lot of times, especially science fiction stories, we have to set the time and place, right? So all this is to say that in this time, in this future, everybody's equal, right? And they're equal because of the law. And what's going to happen is as we read, we're going to see what exactly that looks like or how it's being done. Some things about living still weren't quite right, though. April, for instance, still drove people crazy by not being springtime. And it was in that clammy month that the HG men took George and Hazel Bergeron's 14-year-old son, Harrison, away. Right? So here we go. We are getting the beginnings of the conflict, right? When they say HG men, right? Remember over here we say handicapper general, right? So this is what the HG men are, right? They're people from the government that make sure that people are handicapped, right? And so I'm also seeing that in this text that there is some language that shows me kind of the tone, right? So thing living still wasn't quite right, uh, still drove people crazy, right? And then here, the HG men took Harrison Bergeron's 14-year-old son Harrison away, right? So this is all kind of building up and giving us some background into what's going on and what's the tone, right? So immediately I'm starting to think that the government's the bad guy, right? And the fact that George and Hazel's son was taken, that's going to be part of the conflict, okay? So let's continue. It was tragic, all right, but George and Hazel couldn't think about it very hard. Hazel had a perfectly average intelligence, which meant she couldn't think about anything except in short bursts. And George, while his intelligence was way above normal, had a little mental handicap radio in his ear. He was required by law to wear it at all times. It was tuned to a government transmitter. Every 20 seconds or so, the transmitter would send out some sharp noise to keep people like George from taking unfair advantage of their brains, right? So here we go. This is what we're talking about here, right? So we have the language, it's tragic, right? The fact that uh, their son was taken was pretty bad, right? But here's the thing, because of the handicapping that the government does, they can't even remember that their son was taken, right? It says George and Hazel couldn't think about it very hard. And then the author starts describing these two people. Hazel had a perfectly average intelligence, right? But when you think about what it's saying about her, makes you think that maybe that average intelligence isn't very like normal, right? She couldn't think of anything about anything except in short bursts. So without any help, She's constantly forgetting things, even her son. And then we have George, that while his intelligence is really high, he's in the same predicament as Hazel because of the handicapper that's on his head, right? It keeps sending sounds to him that distract him, that keep him from focusing, right? So George and Hazel were watching television. There were tears on Hazel's cheeks, but she'd forgotten for the moment what they were about, right? So we don't know why she has tears on her cheeks, right? But here's the situation, right? It's very, something she was watching maybe made her sad. On the television screen were ballerinas. A buzzer sounded in George's head. His thoughts fled in panic, like bandits from a burglar alarm. All right. So here we go. This language right here. His thoughts fled in panic, like bandits from a burglar alarm. Right. So the connotation, right, is that his thoughts are the bad guys here. Right. His thoughts are like bandits. Right. So we have a negative connotation, and the noise is what's keeping those negative things away, right? So it's kind of setting up the idea that maybe his thoughts are actually what's dangerous. That was a real pretty dance, that dance they just did, said Hazel. Huh, said George. That dance, it was nice, said Hazel. Yup, said George. He tried to think a little about the ballerinas. They weren't really very good. No better than anybody else would have been, anyway. They were burdened with sash weights and bags of birdshot, and their faces were masked, so that no one, seeing a free and graceful gesture or a pretty face, would feel like something the cat drug in. George was toying with a vague notion that maybe dancers shouldn't be handicapped. But he didn't get very far with it before another noise in his ear radio scattered his thoughts, right? So here we go. We have this idea that the ballerinas that they're watching on TV, normally when you think of ballerinas, they're slender, they're graceful, right? But the ballerinas on this show that they're watching, they have weights on their limbs and on their bodies so that they can't move freely. Ballerinas that might be good looking have masks on their face to make them look less appealing, right? So the idea is that everybody's equal. If you're beautiful, you have a mask on to cover it up. If you're strong, you have weights to make you weaker. If you're fast, you have weights to make you slower. So like the government is trying to make sure that everybody is at the same level. George winced. So did 2 out of the 8 ballerinas, right? So I'm making an inference now that since George winced and since 2 of the 8 ballerinas winced, remember that George has that handicapper on his head to keep his thoughts straight. So since this happens, then maybe 2 of those 8 ballerinas are also actually very smart. Hazel saw him wince. Having no mental handicap herself, she had to ask George what the latest sound had been. Sounded like somebody hitting a milk bottle with a ball-peen hammer, said George. So again, when we talk about the language here, right, having something like this, hitting a milk bottle with a ball-peen hammer, right, think of it as something is being destroyed, right? And in this sense, what's being destroyed are his thoughts, right? So the government is destroying his thoughts with these sounds. I think it'd be real interesting hearing all the different sounds, said Hazel, a little envious. All the things they think up. Said George. Only if I was a handicapped journal, you know what I would do, said Hazel. Hazel, as a matter of fact, bore a strong resemblance to the handicapped general, a woman named Diana Moon Glampers. If I was Diana Moon Glampers, said Hazel, I'd have chimes on Sunday. Just chimes, kind of in honor of religion. I could think if it was just chimes, said George. Well, maybe I'd make 'em real loud, said Hazel. I think I'd make a good handicapped general. Good as anybody else, said George, right? And so that statement, good as anybody else, is suggesting that because everybody's equal, it doesn't matter who really is in charge, right? Because everybody's the same as everyone else. Who knows better than I do what normal is, said Hazel. Right, said George. He began to think glimmeringly about his abnormal son who was now in jail, about Harrison, but a 21-gun salute in his head stopped that, right? Again, the language about these sounds, the 21-gun salute, those 21-gun salutes happen when someone has died, right? And so in this case, this 21-gun salute is kind of signifying that his thoughts are dead. Now, also, as you go through the story, you may think, well, what is another meaning of this 21-gun salute? Maybe it could be foreshadowing something. Right? So keep that in mind while you guys are reading. Boy, said Hazel, that was a doozy, wasn't it? It was such a doozy that George was white and trembling, and tears stood on the rims of his red eyes. 2 of the 8 ballerinas had collapsed to the studio floor, were holding their temples, right? So that gives you a sense of just how powerful these sounds are. All of a sudden, you look so tired, said Hazel. Why don't you stretch out on the sofa so as you can rest your handicap bag on the pillows, honey bunch? She was referring to the 47 pounds of birdshot in a canvas bag, which had padlocked around George's neck. Go on and rest the bag for a little while. I don't care if you're not equal to me for a while. Right? And so I can make the inference, since all of these things that are put on these people are to limit them somehow, right? The fact that he has these weights on him probably suggests I can infer that maybe he's stronger than most people, or maybe he's faster than most people, and that's why he has to have those weights on. George weighed the bag with his hands. I don't mind it, he said. I don't notice it anymore. It's just a part of me. You've been so tired lately, kind of wore out, said Hazel. If there was just some way we could make a little hole in the bag, bottom of the bag, and just take out a few of them lead balls, just a few. 2 years in prison and $2,000 fine for every ball I took out, said George. I don't call that a bargain. If you could just take a few out when you come home from work, I mean, you don't compete with anybody around here. You just sit around. If I tried to get away with it, said George, then other people get away with it. And pretty soon we'd be right back to the dark ages again, with everybody competing against everybody else. You wouldn't like that, would you? I'd hate it, said Hazel. There you are. The minute people start cheating on laws, what do you think happens to society? Right? And so there you go. This statement right here, we really get a sense of what the conflict is, right? The fact that people are cheating on the laws, and we have this, that there's going to be this inequality. Also, you have this idea that, Hazel doesn't really get what's going on, and she can only really understand things emotionally, right? Like, she knows that she would hate if George was actually really smart and really powerful, more powerful than her, right? So, like, the idea of keeping things equal is some way that Hazel will feel safe and equal with George, right? And George, if you look at the way he talks about it, you can make some inferences about how he feels about the situation too. Does he like it? Does he dislike it? I want you guys to think about that based on the language that he uses. Don't just think about how you would feel in this situation. Look specifically at what he says, okay? If Hazel hadn't been able to come up with an answer to this question, George couldn't have supplied one. A siren was going off in his head, right? So a siren, right? So another word that indicates danger. So thoughts can be dangerous again, right? It also, because what's going to happen next in the story, kind of signals the dangerous event that's about to take place, right? So that's it for me. I want you guys to continue reading the story. Keep in mind the language especially when it comes to sounds, what those things mean, and think about the themes, right, that may be going on in the story about equality and the conflict between government and individuals. Okay?